Story 1. Salton Sea, California went to clean out a family member's house after they passed. Didn't see a single car on the road or human that whole weekend. Felt so creepy. Story 4. Amboy, California. All the stories are true. I lived out in 29 Palms while my husband was stationed there a few years back. I heard stories of people getting run off the road, people pretending to have gotten in a car crash so you stop and help, candles being set up in the middle of the road, and so on. His chain of command even had a meeting with them before the Marine Corps ball about not stopping on Amboy because of how dangerous it was. I worked out there too, and I know at least 10 to 15 bodies have been found in the last few years. Story 5, I have to say it. My wife and I were vacationing in Bar Harbor, Maine, and decided to drive to the easternmost point in the United States. So we made it to Lubeck, Maine. It was kind of foggy and looked totally deserted. I understand Stephen King novels now. Story 6. It is barely a town anymore, but definitely Mineral Springs, Missouri. It was once a bustling town with a famous hot spring, but it dried up. Now, various people live in very old houses without electricity. No one knows their names, but they send one person into town a month for groceries. If you are there very long at all, they will shoot at you. Story 7. Pitcher, Oklahoma. Abandoned lead mining town that produced most of the lead for the world wars. The town is riddled with sinkholes from poor mining practices and is the largest Environmental Protection Agency Superfund cleanup site. It's now abandoned due to a combination of people dying of lead poisoning, orange sulfuric acid waters, and a large tornado a few years ago. Story 8. Elgin, Kansas. The motto of the town is "A town too tough to die." A person told me a story about a time they stopped there on a cross-country motorcycle trip. When they parked, they could see people peeking around the corners of buildings. Shortly after, a woman in an old dirty wedding dress came around a building pushing an old Victorian baby stroller. There wasn't a baby in the stroller. It was a toy baby. There are trees growing out of buildings. The main street is an out-of-place, super wide, brick road for herding cattle through the town back in the old times. For such a small town located in the middle of nowhere, it was, for a short time, one of the world's busiest cattle shipping towns. It's a creepy place. Edited, town motto, still just as cool. Story 9. Pitcher, Oklahoma, is an Environmental Protection Agency Superfund site that was being cleaned up and bought out. The town was dying, literally and figuratively, when a tornado came through and took care of enough that whoever had remained left. Now it's a ghost town. Edit, Pitcher, not Pitcher. Story 10. I've traveled through a lot of tiny little back towns all around the western US. In southeastern California, the towns up the west shore of the Salton Sea have a unique kind of eeriness I've never felt anywhere else. Towns like Salton City, Desert Shores, and Oasis. The Salton Sea, for those unfamiliar, is an inland body of salt water. Back around the 1960s, a bunch of little resort towns popped up along its shores. But sometime in the 70s or 80s, a combination of agricultural runoff and wild variations in the salinity of the sea caused fish to die off in massive numbers. The stench of rotting fish pretty well killed the tourism industry, and the towns along the sea have never recovered. They're not quite ghost towns. There are still a few thousand people living in each of the cities I named, but they're only a fraction of the population they once had. I could definitely feel a sort of depressing weight on the towns, and the dead fish smell is still to this day a constant presence all along the seashore. Story 11. I grew up in the poorest town in America, Littleton, West Virginia. It's not even incorporated anymore and has literally been described on Google as the poorest, most depressing place in America, and most definitely in Appalachia. My parents moved us there when I was about 3 out of the city in Pittsburgh, when a flood destroyed the whole street of houses we lived on. The city bought it out to put a trolley track through. My parents were off with the wind. I think at the time my parents thought we were going to move to the country and it was going to be peaceful and quiet and we could start over. Between the opiate epidemic, the poverty levels, and the reality of living in such a rural area with limited access to close jobs and stores, it was far different. I wouldn't change it now that I'm grown, but I definitely saw some things that fit the Appalachian uneducated narrative, trauma, and bad parenting, etc. However, though, I also met many people who are incredibly kind, well-educated, well-rounded human beings, and I do not think that the stereotype is fair. A lot of people hear a person is from West Virginia and immediately assume that they're uneducated, don't wear shoes, and are inbred living in a shack with no electric. Sadly, not true at all, and all of those things can be relevant in other places across the world. But Littleton, West Virginia, definitely is a wasteful black hole of a place, and not a pleasant place to grow up by any means. Story 12. Most towns in East Texas, close to the Louisiana border, don't want you there, and they'll let you know it. I'm a white Texas native, and even I don't feel welcome. Story 13. Trona, California, hands down for isolation, ruin, and an inhospitable environment. I've already been through tiny towns in Wyoming and the South, and Trona still takes the cake. It started as a company town in the early 1900s in a far isolated corner of the Mojave Desert. All that exists is a chemical plant that processes borax. It's old, rusty, and it stinks. It looks like the hills have eyes and Fallout New Vegas. Only about 1,500 people live there, and most houses are burned or torn down. It's miserably hot and incredibly isolated, as it's 3 hours away from any large metropolitan area like Bakersfield. The drive there is through a vast, empty, infinite desert with no cell phone signal. If something happened to you there, nobody would ever know. With that said, it feels rewarding and really cool to cross that whole landscape. Story 14, Whittier, Alaska. Most of the town's residents live in a single apartment building. There's nothing else there. The town is accessible by water and a one-way tunnel through the mountain. Story 15. I don't know its name, but it was about an hour past Las Vegas. I was working at Warped Tour and we stopped for gas at around 3 a.m. This place had giant bugs that swarmed you and left welts on your skin the size of silver dollars. Forget that city. Story 16. I stopped in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, on a road trip 2 years ago. I was downtown, doing a little sightseeing on foot, when I approached a four-way intersection. 3 matching black SUVs pulled up to the stop sign, with blackout tinted windows and full-length Punisher logos on their hoods. The lead car stopped, and someone on the passenger side rolled their window down just far enough that I could see a ball cap and a pair of sunglasses. They stared me down for a few seconds and drove on. The whole experience felt so far off. I went back to my car and left. Later, I did an internet search on the town and found information on the Aryan Nation's compound, the bombings, arsons, attacks on Jewish businesses, and the America First white supremacists that still operate there. Story 17. As you can tell from reading this thread, the entire Mojave Desert, from Las Vegas to the Salton Sea, is all terrifying. A blasted, hellish moonscape full of the weirdest people on the planet. A zombie outbreak would actually improve the place. Story 18. That tiny town where they cut the baby out of the pregnant lady. Or the tiny town where the kid disappeared into thin air and there was a 10-year hunt with 0 clues. Or the tiny town where there is an arson every time they clear the prior arson. No clues, just have to leave burned houses standing. Or the tiny town where 2 kids drowned in the same spot within 3 years. Or the tiny town where they shot a man in broad daylight on Main Street with a few dozen people shopping and at the bar, yet no one saw a thing. Oh wait, all of these are Skidmore. There is no competition, it is Skidmore. Story 19. Florida, Missouri. Creepy, very creepy. I just checked. It is now listed as uninhabited by the living. I am not surprised. Story 20. Covington, Virginia. I've told this story before, and I'll tell it again. A few years ago, I worked as a subcontractor to banks. I was the guy who would knock on your door and tell you to call your bank due to a mispayment. Anyway, I was driving in a new job territory, and as I'm driving down the road, all of a sudden, I come upon a massive fog bank. Takes a good 5 minutes to drive through it. Then, once I reached the other end, it was like someone just cut the fog with a knife. It suddenly ended, and it's stone cold quiet. I mean, I even stopped my car and listened. No birds, no wind, no sound. Feeling creeped out, I slowly drive a bit more, and come out on top of a mountain looking down into the city valley. And it smells like hot dog water. I didn't know it then, but that was due to the paper factory. As I drove into town, it was just one storefront closed after another. It all felt like a Stephen King movie. The whole town seemed like a zombie insect, dead but still moving somehow. As if all that wasn't enough, the cherry on top was seeing a few Nazi flags flying in front of people's houses. After seeing those, I got out of there as fast as I could. Story 21. The Empty Streets and Silent Nights of Rhyolite, Nevada. A classic ghost town with decaying buildings and a general feeling of being watched. Make it incredibly creepy. Story 22. Medicine Bow, Wyoming. I only stayed in the hotel for a night, but it was super creepy. Lights were off in the front, and it hasn't been renovated since the early 1900s, with a bunch of creepy Victorian-era paintings and mouse droppings everywhere. Story 23. Centralia, Pennsylvania. There is an underground mine fire through coal veins that is constantly spreading and emitting noxious fumes. On a road trip once, we wanted to see it, so we ran around and explored. They paid everyone to move away, so it is a ghost town with only the cemetery and streets remaining. Story 24. We took a trip around summer 1998 to see the redwoods in Humboldt County and made the mistake of stopping in Garberville for food and gas. At the subway, the people working seemed incapable of getting our order correct, and when I went to the men's bathroom, I found a young woman dressed like she'd come from a 1970 rock festival passed out in her own vomit with a syringe in her arm. I ran to get the subway manager to call an ambulance. He says to me, "This happens all the time," and then did nothing. I had to convince him to call an ambulance. One of the subway employees said she also worked as a home health aide, and she slowly got up from a chair and went to help the woman. My wife and I went outside and waited for the ambulance, but 2 cops showed up first. They talked to me for a couple of minutes, and at one point when I said I wasn't used to finding women overdosed in a restaurant bathroom, he said, "You've never been to Garberville, have you?" The ambulance pulled in and my wife and I left. No one had made our food, and I just wanted to get out of there. We stopped at a small grocery store next to a gas station, and we bought some snacks after getting gas. And when I commented to the checkout guy that I liked the look of the mountains around the town, he says to me without looking up, "You don't go up into the mountains. You do, and they'll kill you. Don't go up into the mountains." Everyone in the store was looking at me weirdly, and it was like they were all out of central casting for 70s commune/cult member. We got out of Garberville. Later, I learned that the mountains around Garberville were packed with then illegal cannabis farms, and the whole town was like stoner central. Creepy beyond belief. My wife and I still talk about this 25 plus years later. Story 25. Villisca, Iowa, just has a vibe to it. The "we don't like your kind here" vibe. And it's not just that house either. Story 26. The village of West Clay, Carmel, Indiana. Not even remotely dangerous. It is the creepiest, perfect little town that screams Stepford Wife or Truman Show. The houses are built to look antique. The street lights are antique looking. Every yard is picture perfect. The alleys leading to the garages are lit with street lights and perfect. Driving around feels surreal. Story 32. I've lived in Alaska for 3 years, during which time I've had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in the Arctic. While most tourists' idea of Alaska consists of towering, snow-capped mountains that go on forever, pristine streams full of salmon and bears, and misty pine-covered cliffs on the coast, I'm here to tell you that the vast majority of the state is barren, treeless, flat tundra. Nowhere is that more true than in the Arctic. And while there are plenty of Alaskan villages that could outdo the weirdest that the lower 48 has to offer, there's one place that stands out in my mind as far and away the worst and simultaneously the creepiest, and that's Prudhoe Bay. For those not in the know, Prudhoe Bay is the northern terminus of the Alaska Pipeline, which terminates in the south at Valdez, a town that is very much like what I described up top. Prudhoe Bay, however, is basically just an oil refinery parading as a town, and that wouldn't be terribly uncommon or even noteworthy in the lower 48 itself, except that Prudhoe Bay is not a refinery. It's a series of buildings and giant wells on top of the United States' largest oil field, which is twice the size of the second largest. So there's what I can only describe as something that resembles a map from a video game, minus the fun, sitting in the middle of endless tundra, with the most haphazard, dilapidated, wind-whipped buildings surrounding it. In fairness, I've only seen it in the summer, when all its blemishes are on full display in the balmy 38-degree daytime highs. In winter, I imagine that the snow just completely envelopes everything except the largest oil tanks and towering wells. The workers, who get paid extremely well to work there, live in tightly packed trailers or 3 to 4-story buildings on stilts in the mud flats, surrounded by the constant drilling. It looks like a giant cargo ship ran aground there abruptly and all of its random cargo got catapulted onto the land, and wherever it happened to land, that's where it stayed forever. You expect the weather to be cold, but Prudhoe Bay doesn't just stop there. It's usually extremely foggy and windy, which picks up the silt on the tundra in summer and adds to the fog. I've already described the summer temperatures. Winter conditions there might as well be on Neptune. It's hard to believe that anyone can ever work outdoors in the kinds of conditions they see there. For reference, I just looked up tomorrow's weather for Prudhoe Bay. The high is 8 degrees at the end of April, and once you leave the relative safety and civilization of Prudhoe Bay, there's nothing. I don't mean that the way some people describe there being nothing on the outskirts of a given town. At least in those cases, there might be a tree or a hill, maybe even a couple of scattered houses. Once you leave Prudhoe Bay, the nearest town is about 200 miles away, and between the two is literally nothing. Forget trees, there are no plants. I guess there are some grasses and lichens because somehow there's caribou, which means there are also their main predators, wolves and polar bears. And there are hundreds and hundreds of crater-like lakes that are all frozen over 10 months out of the year and become infested with mosquitoes the other 2. And that's it. There is no shelter of any kind from any of these things. No elevation changes to speak of except for the divots in the tundra that create said lakes. If you were somehow transported to the tundra between Prudhoe Bay and Utqiagvik, you should probably hope you brought a gun with 1 bullet. Add to this purgatory on Earth the fact that the sun doesn't rise for about 2 months in the depth of winter, and doesn't set for 2 months beginning in the next few weeks and lasting into July. The conditions are absolutely maddening. I don't care what anyone says, human beings are not meant to live in that part of the planet. Everything there wants you dead. And yet people happily travel there to work in the oil fields in the planet's most brutal conditions, because Prudhoe Bay's god-awfulness stands as a testament to what Americans will do to keep driving our cars.